All right, so I'm Hillary Waters Fayle, and I would love to just tell you a little bit about myself and my work and my story. So this is something that I always start out my artist talks with. It's a quote that I read when I was actually in high school, and it's just something that really stuck with me and resonated. And it's a good reminder too, when I give these talks, that I am just so incredibly lucky to do what I love every day. All right, so I'm starting with this slide, which really shows off my impeccable fashion sense. And I wanted to start here because it's kind of the beginning of the story. As a small child, was very, very interested in art and always drawing and making things. And I think beyond just drawing and painting, I always had this interest in making something. So not just like, something two-dimensional, but maybe something three-dimensional or something with substance or something that I could use. And I think the most accessible thing for me at that point was, textiles. My grandmother taught me how to knit, and I kind of self-taught myself how to embroider, how to sew. My aunt gave me a sewing machine when I was 12 years old. So I was always kind of doing this by myself, as I was growing up. And I'm so lucky to have such a supportive family, both in the arts. I felt very supported to follow my passion, but also in my love for botany and for gardens. Both my grandmothers have beautiful gardens, and my mother as well. That's my mom and I down at the bottom right there. And I think that sort of being instilled in me at a young age has been very influential. And I actually included this picture of the silk ribbon embroidery book because this is the exact book that I got when I was, I think 12 years old, and I got my tonsils out. And this was what I was doing to recover in bed was teach myself how to do silk ribbon embroidery. So definitely interested, in both art and textile art and botanicals from a very young age. Okay. Whoops. Oh my goodness. Hang on a second. So sorry. Malfunction in the slideshow. Okay. So as this is, moving up to my early teenage years, I went to a summer camp, which actually, looking back on it was incredibly pivotal and important in my life. But the summer camp was called Camp Rushford in Western New York. I grew up in just outside of Buffalo. And it was all focused around the idea of learning about the environment, learning about these incredibly intricate ecosystems and the way that everything is interconnected. Focusing on environmental stewardship and how to be a conscious consumer. And it was, it sounds silly, but up to this point, I had been very interested in nature and the natural world and learning about birds and all of these things, the garden. But it wasn't until I got here that I realized that people spent their entire lives sort of devoting themselves to protecting the environment and to making sure that there was, conservation and stewardship, which kind of was just incredible to me and something that I thought was just, amazing and such a good calling, I guess. And so from that point on, I sort of had this back and forth tug of war of like, is that what I want to do with my life? Do I want to be an environmental scientist? Do I want to study biology? Or do I want to study art? What's the right path for me? And so I did end up studying art in college. I went to Buffalo State College and studied specifically textiles. So I went for textile design, and I was lucky enough as a student to study abroad in Manchester at Manchester Metropolitan University. And they had a specific embroidery program at the time. I'm not sure if they still do, but I got there and I was just in heaven. Like, this was like the first time that I think I found a technique that just resonated, and I was obsessed. Like, I had never been obsessed in this way with something before. And I think, when I was there was all this, learning lots and lots of different types of stitch work, but in particular, I really loved the intricacy and the decorative stitches that I could do with these sort of different insertion stitches. they were, they're utilitarian and they're decorative, which I loved. And they were meant to, kind of conceptually join two things together, literally and conceptually joining two things together. So all of this, what I was just loving. And I'm really sorry for the poor image quality here, but it was taken on my, at that point, really not so great digital camera. But everything that I was working on at that time had to be pretty small because it had to go back in my suitcase. So I found myself really honing in on these like teeny tiny things. These are clothing tags, but none of this was, incredibly, I loved the stitch work, but I probably wasn't making the best art. As many students in college, I made a lot of art that was not so great. But this was kind of the start of that. And, oh, geez, I'm so sorry. My computer keeps flipping forward. I'm just going to use the arrows. Okay. So from Manchester, I came home and directly went back to this summer camp, which I continued to volunteer at after I was a camper, and then I worked at when I was 18, all the way up through my 20s. So I came back from England and immediately went to work at summer camp. So I'm the camp cook at this point, and I was having, I had a lot of time in between meals, as you can imagine. And I was like, okay, I can take a nap, I can draw, I can do some stitching, I'll do some stitching. And so I thought maybe I'll stitch on some paper or, I don't know, something that I find in the kitchen. And I was sitting outside on the back porch and I just remember thinking like, I don't want to go inside. And just looking up, and there's this big oak tree above me. And I just thought, hey, maybe I can stitch on a leaf. My studio assistant just joined me here. Sorry about that. And so this is the very first leaf that I ever stitched on. And it was kind of this moment where I finally felt like, holy moly, I'm doing something that actually is meaningful to me. It's combining, these techniques and processes that I have loved for my entire life. And this material that speaks to my desire to talk about our connection to the natural world and the need to kind of figure out a way to be a little bit more in balance with that. And so I was really excited, and I just, continued to like work in this realm with leaves. And these first pieces were, I was definitely working much more with insertion stitching at this point and trying to make that work. And then exploring different, tatting and how to connect things, which at this point was maybe a little bit clumsy, but I figured it out. Also, I don't really ever talk about this part, but I did kind of explorations of trying to figure out if I could stitch directly into trees or onto trees without harming the tree, of course. And this leaf, this is a birch, I believe, and or beech. This, I was like, maybe this is possible, but it's not. It's, eventually going to just fall apart, and the tree will not sustain that. So I continued to just make these pieces and explore with this. I love working with leaves, for so many reasons, but I think they're incredibly unique, all of them, right? No two leaves, even if they're of the same species, are the same. So there's always a consideration to that specific leaf. Like this leaf split, had a crack in it as it was drying. And so, I'm taking cues from the leaves as I'm working with them as well. And certainly there's an endless bounty of this material. Every single year it will replenish, the tree will replenish itself. And so it sort of speaks to this idea of, sustainability and using a material that is endlessly, replenishable. And it's accessible. That's another thing that I love about it, is that I can go outside and just pick something up off the ground or off the tree. Whenever I do take leaves from trees, I tend to try to be really careful about that. Is it a baby tree that needs every single leaf that it has, or is it a mature tree that can handle a little bit of pruning here and there? But of course, I do try to be very respectful. I also feel like there's, beauty, absolutely, beauty is a part of this work. And there's this quote that I love, that is, it's beauty is that in the presence of which you feel more alive. And that's John O'Donohue said that. But I do really think about that, as I'm working with these materials that have so much beauty in themselves. Like, what am I adding to them? And is that speaking more loudly than the natural material? Am I working in collaboration with these materials? I do also think that a thing that is so important to me in this work is the idea of wonder and staying kind of wondrous. I did a talk with my dear friend Lee Suggs a couple weeks ago, and I asked her if she could sum up in one word what the purpose of what she's doing is. What would that be? And so, of course, having asked the question to her, I felt like I needed to have an answer myself. And so I think for me, the purpose would be wonder. My professor when I was in grad school, Susan Iverson, said that beauty is what lifts you. And that has really stuck with me too, that these pieces, I want to do something that when people see them, they feel better, they feel different, they feel like something is possible that you didn't know was possible. And so all of that is in this work for me. And certainly, there's some traditional stitching in here and some things that I'm just kind of making up and taking a little bit of this and a little bit of that and splicing them together. And I was actually a little bit nervous to talk to this group because there's so many experts in the room. And I'm sure, you all probably know more than I do, but I'm just kind of very inspired by traditional stitch work from all over the world. And another quote that I love that I think about all the time when I'm working with these stitches is that tradition is to a community as memory is to an individual. So thinking about that, just like pulling from the past and that idea of the community and the individual, and being able to pull those traditions forward and use them to speak about this connection to the land and to ourselves. I do really think that there is such an important connection to ourselves and each other when we feel connected to the land. So lots of different explorations here. And certainly you'll probably see as I'm flipping through, I'm very inspired, or I have been very inspired recently by geometry and the way that these different shapes seem to fit in line with the leaves or in line with the natural elements that are occurring there. But it's been something that I've been thinking about a lot, this overlapping of geometry and geometric shapes and the natural world. And I think too, with these pieces especially, there's a lot of botanical imagery, and that's kind of like, I was always afraid a little bit to be putting flowers on things, and on some level I felt like I shouldn't, or that was like, I don't know why that was. You have these fears or something in your art, and you're like, why was I afraid of that? But I'm just embracing it here, which is, so wonderful. Finally, I just feel like I can talk about this in a more eloquent way, I guess. Just that the idea of botany, we have always had this relationship with plants, and so I think there is some comfort in having that imagery around us. When you look around, upholstery and plants and everything that we bring into the house that has the theme of botany, wallpaper, all of that is sort of this way of connecting back to the land, to plants in some way. And so just kind of like thinking about these connections as I'm making these pieces, like what is this all about? And just feeling very connected through history to plants and to the making of textiles. Something that I think about is how, as I'm stitching, which is a gesture that can be totally utilitarian, to make clothing, to make blankets, to keep somebody warm. Or it can just be in service of beauty, to lift the soul, to make something just, to give yourself a moment of beauty in your life. And the same thing with botany, the same thing with plants. We're using plants for food, obviously, but also in our gardens to just bring joy and to uplift us. And so as I'm stitching or as I'm working in the garden or picking tomatoes or whatever it is, I do think about how over time my hands are kind of echoing these same gestures that have been, repeated, thousands and thousands of hands over thousands and thousands of years. So that is, I'm going to jump and just talk a little bit about some other things that I have been doing with leaves, and then I'll show you a little bit around my studio and then answer questions. So I'm not going to go through these as slowly, but I will just talk about this. And I do feel like it's related. Here I'm just cutting into leaves and there's not any stitching. So this is just done with either a punch or an X-Acto knife. And I do think this is related. I mean, it's kind of in the same, a cousin to, paper cutting, essentially. And I think paper is a textile. And so I kind of put this in the same category. But these are some pieces that I have just kind of played with. And this is a lot faster for me than stitching. And so it's just kind of a side thing to do to get myself moving. And I generally have more than one thing going on in the studio at once. So I'll have like a fast thing, maybe some slow things, and tons and tons of emails, of course, which I feel like takes a lot of my time. And these pieces are kind of fun. They're just impressions. So I was walking down the sidewalk, walking down the street one day, and there was a ginkgo leaf on the ground, and someone had ridden over it with a bicycle, and the imprint of the tire was very vivid in the leaf. And I thought, like, oh man, that's just a bruise. That's just a bruise or an impression of what happened. I wonder if I could make that, what could I do? So this is just with the end of a bobby pin from my hair, just pressing into the leaf to see, what happened. So these experiments are kind of fun, and the things that sort of fuel my my studio on the side as well. Just keeping it fun, keeping it wondrous. Magnolia petals in the spring. These magnolia petals in Richmond, I have to say, are just absolutely magnificent, and they're out and about for about 1 week. And the same thing, they just bruise so easily, and you can impress on them just about anything, but it's so fleeting. So here on the left is, about an hour after I had made those marks, and then 2 hours later, that's what the petals looked like. So that oxidization is just so fast. And then I put this image in because I don't always think of myself, even though my entire background is in textiles, or somewhat related to textiles. I think I don't always think of myself as a textile artist, but I have this kind of like, these things that I'm very interested in, and this work that I'm doing, I kind of like, when I think about it, I'm like, oh, that goes back to a textile. And so this doily, this is a doily. It's, I cannot make these, but I have always loved them, even though they're, whatever they are, I think they're beautiful, and I always have. And that to me is so related to some of the work that I'm doing now, these larger pieces. And this is, again, there's no stitching involved here. This is just pressed plants. Having worked with plants so much for these stitched pieces, I end up with lots and lots of leaves kind of around the studio. And it just, in playing with them one day, I was like, oh my goodness, I could just like, what could I do with this? And so these mandalas that I've been making, I've just been thinking again about, the interconnectivity and the relationships, and how everything connects and fits in with each other. And, this sense of expansion and wholeness and just, I think totality. And so I've been taking those and then actually printing them using the blueprinting process onto paper. And this piece is hard to tell the actual scale of it, but it's 4 feet by 4 feet, so it's quite large. And then this is a slightly smaller piece. So all of this is kind of happening simultaneously, which I think is it's good for me. It's good for my mind. It's good for me to just keep moving in different directions. And I think it all kind of feeds each other. And so that is kind of I know that there will probably be lots of questions and I'm happy to answer those, but